When it comes to the world of wagons, this has to be one of the sweetest wagons that I have ever seen in my entire life. And that is this 1971 Ford Country Sedan 429 4 Venturi Police Interceptor wagon. And yes, I said Country Sedan, not Country Squire. Many of you know the Country Squire as a Ford wagon, and it was candidly the top of the line Ford wagon for 1971. But the Country Sedan was one below that. It was the Galaxie 500 Country Sedan. So it's kind of like the LTD was to the Galaxie 500 as the Country Squire was to the Country Sedan, if that makes sense. Now, if you're not yet excited enough, let's take a look at the Marty Report for this particular wagon. And you'll notice here that it is a 1971, as I mentioned, Galaxie 500 Country Sedan wagon with the 429 4 Venturi Police Interceptor. And it has the C6 automatic, the U-code C6 automatic. Notice in the statistics box in the bottom right there, it's one of 8 with these engine and transmission codes. So it's one of 8 with that Police Interceptor engine. How crazy is that? And one of 48 with the police package. You'll note that this particular vehicle was ordered as a retail order, not a fleet order, from a dealer in Texas. And I think in addition to the engine and transmission being particularly interesting, another thing that's interesting to me is that it just has a standard open diff. It has a number 6 code, 3.00 to 1 standard axle ratio. In other words, it doesn't have the traction lock rear end. I would have thought that somebody who would buy a Police Interceptor engine under hood would at least opt for the traction lock rear end. But whoever the buyer it was of this particular vehicle did not. And by the way, you can always tell the traction lock rear ends on the Fords because they have a letter as their axle code as opposed to a number. Now let's return back to the vehicle now that your blood is boiling. And let's talk a little bit more about the wagons for 1971. Well, the first thing is that 1971 was a year in which Ford introduced an all-new series of full-size vehicles. There, of course, was the LTD, the Galaxie 500, the Country Squire, the Country Sedan, including the Country Sedan that you see here. But the vehicles had all new styling, and they looked quite good, I think. This was also the era of the so-called Bunky Beak Fords. Notice here that the car has a very prominent proboscis, if you will, and it's similar to the 1970 and 71 Thunderbirds. And that was because Ford had a new president at the time, Bunky Knudsen, who came from General Motors. And Bunky Knudsen, while he most immediately prior to departing for Ford was the leader of General Motors overseas operations, prior to that, he was the general manager of Pontiac division. He wanted the Fords of the era to look like Pontiacs. And so he decided to tell designers to put the so-called Bunky Beak or Knudsen nose on the vehicles. I actually like it. I think that the 71 LTD and the 72 LTD and the corresponding wagons actually look pretty good. Now, by the time Knudsen was ousted, designers started reverting back to other themes, and by 1973, the front end of Fords would start looking different, and the Bunky Beak was gone. It was kind of terminated in 1975 altogether. 1973, it blunted the look overall, perhaps helped by the fact that designers had to redo the car for the 5-mile-an-hour bumper standards. And as we rotate to the side view of this 71 Country Sedan, you'll note a few things. First is that the doors are framed out here. This is not a frameless door glass type wagon. Ford, during this era, the wagons all had the framed doors similar to the pillared sedans. And I guess they did that for structural rigidity on the wagons. And another thing, you'll notice that there's quite a large rear overhang here. One of the things that was interesting about Ford and their wagons as opposed to General Motors and Chrysler was that on Ford wagons, whether you got the Ford or the Mercury wagon, you actually got the shorter wheelbase. You got a 121-inch Ford wheelbase. Mercury's during this time frame were atop 124-inch wheelbase. Lincoln's 127-inch wheelbases. And if you got a wagon, even if it were a Mercury wagon, a Colony Park, you got a 121-inch wheelbase. So you got the shorter wheelbase if you got a Ford wagon. If you got a General Motors wagon or a Chrysler wagon, you actually got the longer wheelbase, irrespective of which division's wagon that you procured. So Ford didn't give you as much value, I guess, in the overall length department or the wheelbase department when you bought a wagon. In fact, while they look large, many of the Ford wagons, their overall length is actually shorter than the coupes, the two-door coupes of the era for that reason. For example, the Colony Park wagon for 1971 actually was about an inch or two shorter than the Mercury Marquis Coupe of the same year. Now, as we look at the styling from the side here, we talked about the Bunky Beak up front. Really not too much to discuss in terms of styling on the body side. You do have this feature line or this crease that's pretty sharp that starts at the beginning of the front fender and terminates partway through the front door. Then you have a similar crease that starts on the rear door and then continues all the way back through the rear quarter panel. Not quite sure why Ford didn't want to make that just one continuous unbroken line, perhaps because it would look a bit monotonous and almost like you just dragged a template across the clay for the entire car, similar to what their clay modelers often did on the lower rocker section. There was often a so-called drag section where you just kind of have a particular form and you drag a template over the clay to form it. You can see here that drag section rocker has that type of a shape. And I have to say Fords during this era, particularly the wagons, had a lot of what I would call architectural styling. I shouldn't say that I would call it that. That would be my friend John Manoogian who would use that term. By the way, you should check out his column in Driven to Write where he writes about his overall history at General Motors Design and a lot of the interesting people there. I'll put a link in the video description so you can read more about John's career. And as we take a look at the rear three-quarter view, you'll notice just how deep that crease really is. It actually protrudes outboard on the vehicle, and it at least breaks up that rear quarter panel, gives it a little bit of dimension. It would look just kind of plain otherwise and very tall. So the designers are trying to at least visually shorten the height of that rear quarter panel by putting some sort of a character line on there. And you'll notice that this is before the big rear bumpers. The bumper on this Country Sedan is rather dainty. Of course, you have Ford's dual action tailgate here. You can open it like a tailgate once you drop the window glass, or you can have it swing outboard. The hinges enabled both types of action. Let's swing over to the interior now and take a look at the inside. Now, we have kind of the standard bench seat up front. You do have the 1971 Galaxie LTD style instrument panel with the horizontal speedometer, but we're going to see this is a special speedometer with certified calibration. And you have a couple other options. It's a relatively base vehicle aside from the police package, but you do have air conditioning, as you notice on the climate control panel there at the bottom left. And of course, you have the requisite air conditioning vents coming through the IP as well. In fact, aside from the police package, this vehicle pretty much just has power steering, which thankfully it came equipped with. But that was really about it in terms of options. So that's a pretty plain Jane car, but you got power steering and air conditioning and the police engine. What more did you need? Zooming in here on the climate control panel, you'll notice a couple switches underneath it. One says fan, that's obviously for the fan speed, off, and then several positions all the way up to high. And then you have the accessory switch. That's to operate the rear tailgate window glass. I always thought it was funny that Ford called it accessory. On the wagons, that would operate the rear tailgate, the power glass. And on the convertibles, that would raise and lower the top. And it just said accessory. I guess Ford wanted only one piece to use on their vehicles, irrespective of whether or not it was a wagon or a convertible that could also activate the rear window style blower defogger on the sedans and coupes. So always thought that was a little interesting piece of trivia. As we zoom in on the speedometer, you can see that it has the so-called certified calibration because this was a police package. Of course, you wanted your police vehicle to read the correct speed. Speedometers during this time frame notoriously had some error to them. It, for example, would be typical if you were going a true 70 miles per hour. The speedometer might read 72, 73, 74, something like that. That was within the normal specs of operation, but clearly was not going to suffice for a police package vehicle. And here we see that this car does not have a radio. This is not a radio delete plate. A radio was optional on these wagons. Somebody just elected not to get a radio, probably because they put a police radio in it. But here you just get this plain fake wood grain plate because no one elected to order the radio for this particular car. The astute observer will also note that this car does not have disc brakes. Take a look at the brake pedal, and you see while it has that round little cutout in the middle, it doesn't say disc brakes on it. And if you got the optional disc brakes, that area would be labeled disc brakes. Here, this must just have front drum brakes. Now let's get to the real heart of the beast under hood, and you have this 429 cubic inch Ford Venturi premium fuel Police Interceptor V8. These were rated around 370 gross horsepower. In some cases, Ford didn't really publish horsepower figures for their Police Interceptor engines, but it would be around that zip code. That's gross horsepower. This is before the net horsepower ratings would come into effect in 1972, which is how they rate cars today. 370 gross horsepower is probably about 280-ish net. So not necessarily a lot by modern standards. But back in the day, 280, 290 horsepower, that was quite a bit. You were really cooking with gas when you had that. And you'll notice a couple things. Obviously, the air conditioner. This has the typical Ford two-piston air conditioning compressor. We mentioned that it has that option. But notice that little flap in the side of the air cleaner with the vacuum diaphragm that is affixed to it. The purpose of that was to open up that flap when there was no vacuum. In other words, at wide open throttle, it would enable another opening in the air cleaner assembly to let more air in and let the engine suck in much more air than it could do just through the snorkel. A lot of people on the GM side would tend to rotate the air cleaner assembly upside down so that the quadrajet could moan and it could get more air. Here, Ford kind of did the work for you by having that extra flap that was vacuum actuated to enable more air to come through and allow the engine to breathe better. You can see that flap a little bit better here in the vacuum line that's running to it, and you can kind of make out on the air cleaner decal where it says Police Interceptor as well. So this was a pretty hot engine under hood, certainly faster than the standard 429, which did make an alleged 360 gross horsepower. I think they underrated the Police Interceptor engines. But, the horsepower was only a difference of 10 in terms of the factory ratings. I think the real rating was significantly different. Now, with the air cleaner removed, you can really see that flap a little bit better. But you'll also notice something, at least the astute observer will notice something about the carburetor on this car and what carburetor that it used. Now, bear in mind that on the regular 460s and 429s of the era, well, any of the Fords with the 4 barrels, they most often used Ford's Autolite 4300 4-barrel carburetor, which, if you're a fan of this channel, you'll know that I am not a fan of that carburetor, despite the fact that I run many of them in my Ford vehicles. And yes, even AMC employed that carburetor on its vehicles. But you'll notice that under hood here is not a Autolite 4300. In fact, it's a Rochester Quadrajet spread-bore carburetor. My goodness, why in the world would Ford do that? Well, the Autolite 4300 was only rated at 600 CFM at this point, and the Quadrajets were making in the 800-ish CFM range. So it was able to get more air and fuel into the engine, and I have to say the Quadrajets, while they are a little bit more tricky to rebuild in some cases, I do find them to be very reliable carburetors overall. They give me considerably less trouble than the Autolite 4300s do. Not sure what your experience is, but for the Ford lover, if you really want to poke them, just let them know that some of the performance engines of this era, they tended to use Holley carburetors, but in some cases they also used Quadrajets. And one great thing about the Quadrajets was that while it was a little bit difficult to change out the primary metering rods and or jets, you could at least richen up your secondaries pretty easily. It's one little screw you take off, and then the 2 secondary metering rods will remove themselves from the air horn assembly, and you can swap them out, give yourself a little bit different fuel mixture if you want. So something to bear in mind. You can get those at quadrajetparts.com, and you can just try them out on your own Quadrajet, swap it out, see if you get a little bit more power, particularly if you've got an engine from the later 1970s. Might get you a little bit more oomph through a richer mixture when you stomp on the gas. So what do you think of this wagon? I think it's absolutely awesome. It's one of my favorite wagons of all time, from the red paint to what's under hood. I also think that it's kind of a cool-looking, menacing wagon. You're certainly going to notice it if it's coming up in your rearview mirror behind you. Speaking of rearview mirror, one thing that's strange to me is notice the driver's side outside rearview mirror here is the remote control styled type. And then here's a picture of the same car from a few years prior, back when apparently somebody owned it who had it dressed up as a police vehicle. And the outside rearview mirror is the standard kind that doesn't have the inside control. Not quite sure what happened there, but I wonder what happened to this vehicle. It sold on Bring a Trailer back in 2018. Does anybody know what happened to it? I'd love to learn more. Drop me an email. But until then, let me know what you think of this particular awesome, fast wagon. Thanks again for watching.